Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at proposals for democratic reform in the UK. What are the problems that reformers want to address? What are the proposed solutions? And is there any chance they'll be implemented? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Democracy is struggling in the UK and around the world. Many voters feel utterly alienated from politics, believing that those who are supposed to represent them in fact pursue their own narrow interests. Polarisation, fed by changes in the media, is inhibiting reasonable debate. It often feels as though money is what really talks. So many people are thinking about whether our democratic systems could be reformed in ways to improve their functioning and strengthen their resilience. Now, many proposals are out there seeking to address a whole range of problems in different ways. We can't talk about all of them, alas, in a single podcast episode. So today we're going to discuss just a couple of proposals for reform of UK democratic institutions that are explored in recent articles in our sister journal, The Political Quarterly. One of these examines donations to political parties. The other looks at the role of small parties within the proceedings of the House of Commons. And I'm delighted to be joined by authors of both pieces. Ian McMenamin is Professor of Comparative Politics at Dublin City University and an expert on political finance, and he's co-author of the article on donations. And Louise Thompson is Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Manchester, expert in all things parliamentary, and author of the study on small parties. Ian and Louise, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on. And we're going to start by digging into each of your articles in turn before exploring some wider themes. And maybe it makes sense to start with the financing of political campaigns and the process by which MPs are elected before we turn to what happens once they're elected. So, Ian, let's begin with your article, which, as I said, is on political donations. Could you maybe just define what it is that we're actually talking about here? What do we mean by political donations, and what are the current arrangements in the UK?
Well, a donation is a gift given for political purposes or to a political actor. So most notably, in the case of Britain, that's candidates and political parties. The arrangements for donations here are very transparent and they're very permissive. So in Britain, if you're a researcher like me, or you're a journalist, or you're a citizen, you can find information on what donations have been given to candidates and parties more easily and more conveniently and in better time than almost anywhere else in the world. But then in terms of permissiveness, the UK is very unusual as well. So if anybody or anything that is British can give as much as they want, any amount of money for as a donation for political purposes, and that's really unusual. In other countries, is either a limit on how much you can give, or donations are limited to individuals, so basically voters, those who are entitled to vote. Whereas in Britain, actually most donations over the last 25 years have been given by legal individuals, so companies, trade unions, unincorporated associations, other types of legal individuals.
So I guess the UK system is based on the idea that you regulate in terms of capping how much political parties can spend rather than how much they can receive. Is that right? So there's kind of a different logic to the system in the UK from, I guess, in many other places.
That's true. So it's election focused. So they can spend as much as they want, but they can't spend as much as they want in an election campaign.
Yes.
Right? So
yes,
you can be given billions and you can spend billions outside of the election campaign. But within the election campaign, you're quite constrained. And that's an important point. UK elections are cheap, they're modest, and UK political finance also as a whole is cheap or modest in terms of, for example, how much parties and candidates receive and spend per voter. It's quite inexpensive in the UK.
Okay. So your article analyzes whether these arrangements in the UK are fit for purpose. How should we make a judgment of fitness for purpose here? What kinds of criteria should we be using in order to illuminate?
You warned me of this in the intro, and it's not actually something we looked at in the article. So I've been desperately trying to theorize here. I think that political finance is not important in itself. It's important insofar as it affects democratic competition in a more fundamental way. So you've got to think about what are the effects of it on democratic competition. And that, I think, is basically what we did in our article. So the three things that we were worried about are related really to the permissiveness of the UK political finance system. The three things basically were inflation. So inflation in terms of the cost of politics. So obviously enough, if you think anybody can give as much as they want, you have a danger of inflation, of politics becoming incredibly expensive. That hasn't happened so far. So over the last 25 years, if you look at the value of the reported donations, they haven't gone up, which is actually quite amazing. Then the second threat is in terms of corruption. So that people might be giving large amounts of money in order to get something back, to get a policy benefit, basically bribery, or something which is so subtle that it's short of the legal definition of bribery, but from the ordinary citizen's point of view is something pretty similar to that. And then the third one is the distortion of democratic competition. And that's the one that most of the commentary prior to us has focused on in terms of, are you going to have an advantage for one political party or one type of candidate over another? And so that, in terms of corruption, it hasn't happened, we think, so far, notwithstanding some, particular scandals in a general sense. It hasn't happened because one of the ways we think, okay, if you could buy public policy in the UK, then that would be really valuable for economic actors, and they would spend some money doing that. But the contribution rate for UK companies is 0.75%. So they don't think there's anything worth buying.
As in 0.75% of companies in the UK are donating to political parties
annually. Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as that's the best calculation there is, the one we've done. So anyway, it's really, really low. That's the main thing about it.
Yeah, I found that point really, really interesting. And it was one that had never really occurred to me before, actually. But it makes total sense. So the fact that very few companies are making donations, you see as a sign that essentially companies don't think that they're going to gain terribly much in terms of their own narrow self-interest from donating, which is a sign that the system has not been corrupted.
Yes. So that would suggest that the system has not been corrupted. I mean, now, it's very hard to know, but that is a sign that it hasn't been corrupted. One of the other ones would be that if you were spending money to try to get benefits from those in power, then the money would be correlated with who's in power. So the government, the governing parties would get a lot more money than non-governing parties. So we don't see that for the Liberal Democrats and for Labour. We do see it to some extent for the Conservatives. But that's hard to disentangle from another relatively unique aspect of political donations to the Conservatives. We think that there's a fairly general relationship that the Conservatives get money when they're popular. And, you have to be reasonably popular to get into government in the first place. Whereas, again, for Labour and the Liberal Democrats, there doesn't seem to be a general relationship there. So in terms of distortion of political competition over the last 25 years, it does look like there is some potential for the system to have been distorted because of the relationship between the Conservatives and their popularity and whether they're in power. But overall, it's important to emphasize that we think the UK political finance system has been lucky. So there hasn't been huge corruption. There definitely hasn't been inflation. And probably what distortion there has been limited as well. But this doesn't mean that having a system where you can give unlimited donations isn't really, really dangerous. And I'm delighted to say that since we published our piece, the biggest ever donation that there has been has occurred in the UK. Now, it wasn't 100 million as Elon Musk had threatened to give, it was 9 million, but it's still the biggest one ever. It's to a rising opposition party, the Reform Party. But clearly, if that were to set off a race between the parties, I think that would be damaging. Or if Reform were to continue to get more huge donations like that, that also would be damaging. So I think it indicates the risk that is there in the UK political system. And I suppose the other one, just to link to some of what, Louise will be talking about, this was a risk when you had a stable political system with two largely centrist parties. Now you've got an unstable political system, which the whole of the world now has in terms of voter preferences. But of course, in Britain, this whole risk is magnified by, unfortunately, you're stuck with the first past the post electoral system. So now you've got fluidity of voter preferences multiplied by magnification and distortion from first past the post, multiplied by potentially further magnification and distortion from political finance. So that would be something that would worry me in the coming years in relation to the UK.
Great, thank you. So that's really, really clear. So the system, we can evaluate it against various standards. And so far, actually, it's largely been performing okay against those standards. But inherent in the current system, without any caps on donations, there are dangers, there are risks. And you're suggesting that maybe we're starting to see those risks manifesting themselves, most notably with this big donation, the biggest ever donation to a political party just the week before we're recording this episode.
Summary, you're a great host.
Too kind. What then should be done about this situation?
Yeah. So again, our article doesn't talk about that very much. We really zero in on one very conventional option in terms of Western European, or indeed generally in European countries. And that is, if you like, a grand bargain where private political finance is limited and the state comes in and compensates political parties with more substantial public funding. So there is some public funding in the UK. It's absolutely tiny. It's really miserly in a comparative perspective. So that's the most obvious deal. And we argued in our article that maybe for the first time ever, that a deal like that is in the interest of the three traditional parties. So the Conservatives, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats, because obviously the Conservatives had a really terrible election, and there's a lot of talk about the disappearance of the Conservatives. Labour won a lot of seats, but they didn't win a lot of votes. And they've been doing terrible with the voters ever since. And of course, the Liberal Democrats know what it's like to be the beneficiaries of the electoral system in one election and then to really be shafted by it in the subsequent election. So if the three parties thought about it, and if they thought they could dedicate the time to it, that is a deal that would be good for all of them. because, again, it relates to the issue of the fluidity of voter preferences. So this would give you some temporal smoothing, right? So if you have a bad election, this will sort of cushion the effect of it, and it would enable you to come back again. Whereas if you have a really bad election and there's no sort of financial support to keep you going over the 5 years, it's very hard to come back again. So we think that basic option, which has been rejected twice over the last 25 years, is now seems to make more sense to the traditional parties than it did previously. At the other end, a colleague of mine, Samuel Power at the University of Bristol, he's made a really great, very simple minimalist proposal, which is just to limit donations at 1 million. He's really hoping that somebody will take this up as a private member's bill, because how do you argue against this? Like £1 million. Why does somebody need to give more than £1 million? That's a minimalist one. I think in between that actually is Germany. So Germany is very unusual in Europe as well, in that unlimited donations are permitted and are permitted from companies. But there's substantial political funding, public political funding there. So that makes the risk of distortion from private political finance much lower than it is in the UK.
Thank you, Ian. I'll probe further into how likely this actually is to happen. You've given some theoretical reasons for thinking it might, but before we get there, let's bring Louise into this conversation. And Ian has very much framed the changes that he's been talking about there in terms of the destabilisation and fragmentation of the party system in the UK. And Louise, this is something that you've been thinking about very much in the context of Parliament and understanding how Parliament functions as well. So do you want to tell us what it is that you're focusing on in your analysis?
Yeah, okay. So I think I can probably pick up quite nicely from where Ian left off, talking about, what the last general election has told us about the political party system. Because what my article is essentially saying is that we increasingly have a electorate who is voting for a wide variety of political parties. And we can see that reflected in the situation on the floor of the House of Commons in terms of, how many parties we have represented, but that is not necessarily reflected in the rights that we give these political parties, day to day in Parliament. And just as examples of that, the last election was what you could describe as the least two-party general election ever. So we have a total of 12 political parties who took their seats in the House of Commons. We saw the Liberal Democrats perform the best they've ever performed and get 72 seats. We saw the Greens quadruple their representation. We saw Reform become the most successful challenger party ever with their 5 MPs. And in terms of votes, the number of people voting for parties beyond the Conservatives and Labour reached over 40% for the first time. So we can see that there's a real multi-party environment. Yet when you look at the House of Commons, you can see just from looking at the chamber how much it is designed essentially for one governing party, one official opposition party, and since the sort of 1990s, a third party kind of tagged on at the side, and it's not really designed for everybody else.
So you were talking there about the physical design of the chamber being with the two rows of seats kind of facing each other in opposition. But this applies also to the rules of procedure in the House of Commons as well, doesn't it? Do you want to give us a few examples of the ways in which those rules are skewed towards an assumption of a two-party system?
Yeah, I can do. So I think probably the best way of looking at it is in terms of how political parties can contribute to debates on the floor of the House of Commons, and then what happens to parties in committees. So if you think about debates on the floor of the House, if you are the official opposition party, so if you're the Conservatives right now, then you receive guaranteed speaking slots basically in everything. So that might be following a government statement. It might be the second reading of a piece of legislation on the floor of the House, and you will be the first speaker after the government minister has spoken. And if you're the third party, you will then be the next one. You get that guaranteed slot and right to speak. We see that at Prime Minister's questions as well. We get Kemi Badenoch with 6 questions every week to the Prime Minister. We see the third party, the Liberal Democrats, receiving 2 questions every week to the Prime Minister. The other parties in the House essentially get nothing. There are no guaranteed slots or rights for them in terms of speeches on the floor of the House. We can also see it when we look at opposition day debates. So time on the floor where opposition parties can choose the topic for debate each parliamentary session. There are 20 days in total. If you look at the standing orders of the House of Commons, 17 of those go to the official opposition, 3 of those go to the third party, so Liberal Democrats. There is nothing guaranteed for any other political party. Same, essentially, if we look at committee places, the official opposition and the third party are guaranteed seats on every select committee and guaranteed chair slots on every committee. All the other small parties, they have no rights to anything. So, we have this multi-party system, but essentially the official opposition get all of the spoils, more or less. The Liberal Democrats get a little bit. Everybody else gets nothing.
That's really clear. Thank you. And I guess the same question arises as for Ian around, well, what should the criteria be here that we apply? I mean, in the way you've described that you're implying, I guess, that a principle of proportionality ought to be applied, and that so large parties presumably should get more time, but there should be a fair share of time for smaller parties as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the major issues with how the present situation works, that the problem is that there are no guarantees of anything for these parties. There is no kind of sense of what they have a right for. And I think it would be ridiculous to say every party should have a right to speak at everything and every party should have a committee place on every committee. That's not going to work in practice. So it's more about how to think about that, how that proportionality should work. Maybe thinking about actually setting down on paper, if you're a party of a certain size, then what do you have a right to, or what can you expect? What sort of, just to kind of build in some sort of consistency, I guess, and set of expectations about what each party should receive in the House.
I guess there's an alternative view of the British Constitution that says that the role of Parliament is basically to sustain a government, to provide a government, and to provide an alternative government. And that's how the procedures are. I mean, that's the purpose of the design of the procedures, that it should deliver these two things. Are you just saying that is a view of the Constitution that is wrong, or is it unsustainable in the current time? What's your view of that?
I don't necessarily think that's wrong. We're never going to move away, or I think we would struggle to move away from that majoritarian idea that, the official opposition should receive a right to a lot of things in the chamber. I think if you look at how it works in practice, and if you think back to the run-up to the last general election, there were a lot of polls showing that perhaps we might not have the Conservatives as official opposition anymore, or that the official opposition and the third party could be very, very close in seats. And I think even if you look at the balance now between how many Conservative MPs we have, so 119 Conservatives right now, 72 Liberal Democrats, the gap in the rights that we give those two parties, it doesn't feel right when you look at the balance of MPs. And there could literally be one MP difference between those two parties, and we would still give all those rights, extra rights, to the official opposition. So I think it's thinking, how do we work within that current idea of we need an official opposition within our political system? They have that right as that perhaps government in waiting, but how can we make it fairer for the other parties and make the gap between those rights, a bit less severe than it is at the moment?
And you framed that in terms of the rights that the system gives to the various parties and the kind of formal rules around these things, I guess. Is that also a description of how things work in practice, or is the reality sometimes a bit different from the principle?
Do you mean do the parties work informally in different ways?
So I mean, for example, you said that the smaller parties have no rights at all to opposition day debates. They have no rights at all to getting called, their leaders being called in Prime Minister's questions. I mean, is that how it works in reality, that they really don't get that time, or is there some allowance made?
Yeah. So in practice, there are ways to kind of circumvent the rules, and small parties have worked to find ways in which to get some of those rights that they currently lack. So Prime Minister's question time will be one example of that, where there's kind of an informal agreement with the Speaker that one small party MP will be called to ask a question every week. And if you look at the sort of the Hansard transcripts of Prime Minister's question time, you can kind of work out and see there's been a rough rotation across all the parties. But I think a lot of that relies on negotiation, and it relies on good informal kind of working relationships with key people. So that might be the speaker, it might be the bigger party whips. And that's one thing that I think makes it increasingly difficult when you've got so many small parties, because some of those smaller parties have really good relationships with the bigger parties and other small parties perhaps less so. And that is perhaps what explains why, if you look at the Greens, for instance, that they do very well to find seats on select committees. Every member of their party, parliamentary party, has sat on a public bill committee in the current parliament. But you compare that to, say, Reform, and they've not had a seat on any public bill committees. They've not got a seat on any departmental select committee. One of their MPs is on the Speakers Conference Committee, but that's a little bit different. So, that you can see how parties may struggle if they haven't been able to maintain those kinds of relationships.
So when the Green Party is getting seats on select committees and public bill committees, it's getting those basically because the leaders of the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party and the Conservatives are supporting that. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially asking the Greens may ask the Labour whip, for instance, if they could have a seat, and it would mean that Labour whips would have to remove one of their MPs from that committee and let the Greens have a seat, which happens quite a lot in practice. But it requires you to actually go to the bigger parties and say, this is what I'd really like. Please, can you do this for us?
How interesting. Gosh, I didn't know that. So what should happen? How should things operate?
Well, I would really like to see two things. And one would be, I'd like to see the informal rules at the moment kind of written down so that it's clear what every party has a right to. And that might be about rights to questions at Prime Minister's Question Time, things like that. And I think it would also make sense to think about perhaps what some of the other devolved parliaments do and have some sort of threshold for the size of a party group that then might entitle you to a certain set of those rights, which could be written down. So I'm probably going to get this wrong now. Now I'm on the spot, but I think in Wales, it's 3 members of parliament. And in Scotland, I think it's 5 to form an official political group. And if you reach that threshold, then, you have those rights to take part on different committees. And you could see how that might function in practice in the House of Commons, because it would mean that we could draw a line perhaps and say that, parties with 1 or 2 MPs, maybe you don't have those automatic rights. But if it gets to parties of maybe 5, 6, 7 MPs, wherever you draw the line, I don't want to be the one to say where to draw the line, that then maybe you would know what your rights were. And it would just make it much more consistent, I think, and it would show parties what their guaranteed rights were.
This leads, of course, on to the question that I was pointing towards at the end of Ian's remarks as well. Is this actually going to happen? How likely are the changes that you've both been talking about here to take place? Maybe we should flip back to Ian on this and pick up what you were saying. So you were suggesting, Ian, that actually you think there may be appetite in the main parties in the UK today for adopting donation caps and introducing spending public funding of political parties as well in order to compensate for the loss of funding to parties.
No. So I'm told by people who are much better informed than me that there is no appetite. However, what we're arguing is that lack of appetite is because they're not thinking about their current situation, and they're definitely not thinking forward. So
your argument is that it's in their interest to do this, but it's not that they yet want to do it.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
So, subject of political finance reform comparatively is underdeveloped because it's a tricky thing to study, and there are lots of other things to study which are easier to study. Well, one of the core ideas of that literature is that in majoritarian countries, which, Britain was the archetype, it's sort of collapsing in various ways, that reform usually only happens if there's a scandal where especially a governing party is forced into a situation where it thinks it's really losing votes by letting the system stand as it is. So that's obviously not the current situation in the UK. So, the most likely case for reform then would be if there's a big corruption scandal for Labour. And then they think this has now become salient. We have to be seen to do something which sort of constrains the power of private money coming into our party and coming into government. And then maybe they would go for a deal which constrains private money and increases public subsidies. I mean, I've studied other countries where, more consensual countries, where actually a scenario a bit like the one in the UK has led to an increase in public funding and actually a distribution of public funding which benefits the smaller parties rather than the bigger parties. So I've seen in other countries a situation where there are parties which are losing support and they really think they're going to get slaughtered at the next election. And they think, okay, one way of ensuring ourselves is through the political finance system and making sure it looks after smaller parties. So that's another type of scenario which is closer to the current British situation. You know, part of the problem is that I would say, even if, say, a Labour government thought this was a good thing, the nature of Parliament, and probably Louise knows this better than me, is that, well, it's very busy and there's only so much time that the Parliament itself has, or that a government has and a department has. So they'd have to give up something else in order to make a big effort to bring forward quite a major change in the political system. And there doesn't seem to be an appetite for that at the moment.
Louise, as Ian says, you're following what MPs are thinking in the UK Parliament all the time. Do you have views on the likelihood of political finance reform in the UK?
Well, I think the only thing I'd say is that things like this tend to be more likely to happen if there is a threat that it might affect you in the wrong way. And if we see, like, that donation to reform recently becoming more commonplace, then just like with small party rights, if you think something's going to adversely affect you as a government, then you're more likely perhaps to actually put the effort into doing that reform than you would otherwise if it's really not going to affect you.
Yeah. And I guess the other aspect of this that politicians often are concerned about, I think, is that they just think that introducing higher state funding would be very unpopular. And they see it as necessary in order to deal with the shortfall in funding for political parties that would arise with a low cap, at least. But they just don't think that it would be politically acceptable. But maybe if you go the Sam Power route that Ian talked about earlier, with a very high cap, then that danger is much lower, and therefore you could get away with it. Very interesting. And Louise, what about the case of reform to the parliamentary standing orders? Do you think there's a chance of that happening?
I think if it's going to happen, now of this Parliament is a really good opportunity for it to happen, partly because there are more small parties really pushing for things to change. And, reform, Nigel Farage, perfect example of that. I mean, Nigel Farage's complaints about not getting any time at Prime Minister's Question Time, his decision to go and sit in the public gallery rather than on the floor of the Commons. Because of that, it's making the issue of small party rights more visible. It's a contrast to when I first started researching them, and really it was only me and a few other people who cared that this didn't seem very fair. But also alongside that, we've got the creation of the Modernisation Committee in this Parliament, which has committed to, making things fairer for backbenchers. And, Lucy Powell, before she left as Leader of the House, committed to trying to make things, or think about how to make things fairer for small parties. So, I would think now is a really good chance to actually try and get some movement on how the system is at present.
It's interesting because you're both there referring to two kinds of mechanisms, I think. There's a sort of present mechanism and a future mechanism. So there's a present mechanism around it being perceived that there's political damage to not changing the rules. So you're suggesting there, Louise, I think that Nigel Farage is given an extra hammer with which to bash the system and claim the system is unfair towards him and the people who are supporting him by the current rules. And by changing the rules, Labour would be able to remove that hammer from his hand. And similarly, Ian was suggesting that if you have corruption scandals, then politicians will feel the need to respond to those corruption scandals with changes. And then there's also the future mechanism that you're both alluding to, that the big parties now, in a more unstable situation, might fear that in the future they might no longer be big parties, and therefore they have to protect themselves against losses. Ian, you ought to come in.
I was just thinking, why don't they offer Reform a deal? They say, listen, it's not fair that the leader of what has been often the most popular political party in the country has very little chance to participate in parliamentary debates. That's not fair. We're going to change it. And it's also not fair that somebody gives £9 million to a political party. So let's have a grand board. Let's do both simultaneously as part of a modernisation of the rights of parties in Parliament and of political finance. I mean, I'm not sure if anybody has any appetite for that, but that's again a bit like the Sam Power proposition. It's one that's hard to argue against. It's only by sort of cynically ignoring the argument that you defeat it. But it's very hard, I think, to defend, given the current political environment, the disproportionate speaking rights of the traditional parties. It's also really hard to defend massive donations once the debate begins.
Louise?
Yeah, I mean, you could see how you could perhaps government could suggest, let's give Nigel Farage some extra time, a little bit, just to make him feel better. Then we might not have all those protests and about how little rights I have in the chamber. But then you can't give something to Reform without doing it to all the others. So then it's like, we've got to give Plaid the same rights, SNP the same rights. Otherwise, it's not fair. I think as we go along and get close to the next election, you could kind of see a situation where the Conservatives are looking at what's happening, Labour MPs are looking at what's happening and thinking, crikey, this could be us. We wouldn't want to be in that situation. I think one of the really tricky things about party rights is that if you've only ever been a large party MP, you have no idea how the situation is for anybody else. And that was a big thing, with the Change UK MPs a few years ago when they crossed the floor. They suddenly realised how hard it was and were very vocal in their protests about what rights they should have. And Nigel Farage is sort of performing that for them now. He's telling them exactly what it is like to be a small party. So I think it's probably much more in their heads. And if you think you're going to be there one day, or you could be there, you're perhaps much more likely to actually think maybe we should start to do something about this.
Very interesting. We could talk about this for a long time, but we are, alas, out of time. So watch this space to see what actually happens in the UK Parliament over the next little period. But thank you so much, Louise and Ian, for stimulating our thoughts on these subjects, and much more to get into in order to really understand what is going on. We have been discussing two recent articles in the journal The Political Quarterly. The first article is called Unbroken but Dangerous, the UK's Political Finance Regime and the Rationale for Reform by Logan De La Torre, Kevin Fahey and Ian McMenamin. And the second one was Modernising the House, Why the 2024 Parliament Highlights the Need to Formalise Party Group Rights in the House of Commons by Louise Thompson. And we will, as usual, put the full details in the show notes for this episode. And let me remind you that the Political Quarterly, like this podcast, seeks to make the best research in political science accessible to wider audiences. So do go to its website to explore recent articles on a whole host of issues, including housing policy in the UK, what it will take for a woman to become President of the United States, and the fragility of security in Nigeria. This is our last episode for 2025. We'll be taking the next few weeks off to roast some chestnuts and hang up our stockings, but we will be back in January with more cutting-edge research from UCL and beyond, and we'll look forward very much to seeing you then. To make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening, and have a very happy Christmas.